Kevin Matthews, a black man, was enjoying a rare, quiet afternoon in a park, trying to savor the peace and tranquility of the moment. It was the kind of day that invited calm reflection, warm air, a slight breeze, the sun shining down on the lush greenery, and the peaceful hum of everyday life. Children ran and played, dogs barked happily, and the world seemed to be in perfect harmony. Yet in a split second that peace would shatter. Officer Derek Hines, patrolling the park, took one look at Kevin and immediately deemed him suspicious. Not because of anything he had done, but because of how he appeared. Kevin sat calmly on a bench beneath a towering oak tree, absorbed in his book. Dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, he blended in, unremarkable to anyone who didn't look twice. Yet Derek, a seasoned officer with nearly 15 years of experience, had a gut feeling that couldn't be ignored. What was it? Why did this man, this unassuming figure, stir such unease in him? There was nothing inherently wrong with Kevin, nothing that screamed out of place, nothing overtly suspicious, but Derek couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. As his gaze lingered on Kevin, Derek's mind flashed to a recent bulletin, a vague description of a suspect, a tall black male, around 40, possibly involved in burglaries across the city. It was just a blip on most officers' radar, but Derek's instincts were different. They told him to trust the feeling, trust the gut. And now, as he stared at Kevin, that feeling was undeniable. Kevin felt the officer's stare, a searing intensity that seemed to bore into him. He looked up, briefly meeting Derek's gaze. For a moment, it was as if both men understood without saying a word. Kevin had been here before. Too many times. The suspicion, the assumption. In his experience, reacting too quickly would make him seem aggressive. Too still would make him appear defiant. Neither option was ever good. And so he remained composed, calm, waiting for the next move. Derek approached, his footsteps deliberate, his hand resting on his belt just near his baton. The tension was palpable, thick in the air. "Afternoon," he said, his voice tinged with a forced politeness that didn't fool either of them. Kevin, ever the master of control, nodded back. "Afternoon." He wasn't here for a confrontation, just a quiet moment in the park. But Derek's eyes flickered over him, his clothes, his book, his posture. It wasn't enough. "What brings you out here today?" Derek pressed, the question an interrogation disguised as small talk. "Just enjoying the day," Kevin answered simply, closing his book and placing it gently on his lap, making sure his hands were visible. Derek's scrutiny didn't ease. It wasn't enough. Something didn't sit right with him. Kevin didn't belong here, at least not in Derek's mind. It wasn't about the fact that Kevin was sitting, reading, looking peaceful. It was something else, something Derek couldn't quite name. "You from around here?" Derek asked again, pushing for more. Kevin, ever polite, offered a smile. "I've been around," he said. But it wasn't the answer Derek wanted. And it certainly wasn't the one he expected. "Mind if I see some ID?" Derek pressed, not taking no for an answer. Kevin felt the weight of the question. It wasn't about the ID. It was about the power Derek was trying to assert over him. He had no obligation to provide it. But refusing might escalate things in a way neither of them needed. "Am I under arrest?" Kevin asked, his voice calm, unthreatening. Derek's response came quickly, his grip tightening ever so slightly on his belt. "You will be if you don't cooperate," he said, his tone hardening. Kevin glanced around. People were still living their lives, unaware of the drama unfolding just feet away. With a soft sigh, Kevin reached into his pocket, retrieved his wallet, and handed over his ID, carefully watching Derek's every move. Derek snatched the ID, his eyes scanning it quickly, looking for something, anything that would validate his suspicion. But there was nothing to indicate danger, nothing to justify his assumptions. Still, Derek wasn't satisfied. "Stand up," he ordered, his voice sharp. Kevin complied without hesitation, standing slowly, keeping his hands in clear sight. The officer's suspicion still didn't dissipate. With a swift motion, Derek reached for his handcuffs. Kevin felt a surge of frustration rise in his chest, but he remained silent. He knew any outward display of anger could escalate things further. As Derek cuffed his wrists, Kevin's thoughts spiraled. Not just about this particular moment, but the countless times he had been reduced to a stereotype, assumed to be a criminal because of the color of his skin. The murmurs of the bystanders washed over him, but he focused on keeping his composure, on staying calm. Derek led him to the patrol car, his steps quickening, a sense of urgency in his actions. But in the pit of his stomach, Derek felt an unease, a feeling that something wasn't right, something he couldn't yet put his finger on. But there was no turning back now. Kevin's mind, on the other hand, was already calculating what would come next. He knew how this worked, how it always worked. It wasn't his first time dealing with a cop like Derek, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. As the door of the patrol car slammed shut, the reality of the situation loomed over both of them, heavy and unavoidable. Arriving at the station, Derek led Kevin inside. His grip was unnecessarily tight, but Kevin didn't resist. He had learned long ago that resistance only made things worse. Officer Jenkins, sitting at the front desk, looked up in surprise. "What's this about?" he asked, his gaze flicking between Derek and Kevin. "Suspicious activity," Derek muttered, handing over Kevin's ID. Jenkins glanced at the ID, recognition flickering in his eyes before quickly masking it. "Captain Roberts is in her office. Take him to her," Jenkins instructed, handing back the ID. Derek hesitated. He hadn't planned on involving the captain, but now there was no choice. He led Kevin down the hall, the tension thick in the air. Captain Roberts, seated at her desk, looked up as they entered. "Caught this guy in the park," Derek said, his tone stiff. "He was acting suspicious." Captain Roberts studied Kevin for a moment, her sharp eyes narrowing, as she looked from him to the ID Derek held. Then it happened. Recognition. Her expression flickered for just a second, before she quickly masked it. "I see," she said, her voice carefully controlled. Then, the words that Derek wasn't prepared for. "Officer Hines, step outside for a moment." Surprised, Derek looked at her, confusion evident in his eyes. But the command was firm. He had no choice but to comply. As soon as the door closed behind him, Captain Roberts turned to Kevin. "Mr. Matthews, I apologize for the misunderstanding," she said quietly. Kevin's calm smile barely shifted, but there was a hint of relief in his eyes. "No need to apologize, Captain," he replied. "You're just doing your job." She nodded. "But Officer Hines doesn't know who you are, and that's a problem." She glanced at the ID once more, then leaned back in her chair, clearly calculating the next steps. "We'll handle this appropriately." Kevin's smile faded. "It shouldn't matter who I am, Captain. My name, my job, they shouldn't be the reason I'm treated with respect. It's the principle." Captain Roberts met his gaze, her expression softening with understanding. "You're right. It shouldn't matter. But unfortunately for some people, it does." As she stood to open the door, Kevin felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. He knew this wasn't the first time he'd been in this situation, and it wouldn't be the last. But for now, he was about to walk out, a small victory in a battle that was far from over. When Derek returned, his face was a mixture of confusion and unease. Captain Roberts, with a calm authority, addressed him. "Officer Hines, Mr. Matthews here is not the man you were looking for. Release him immediately." Derek blinked, processing the words with slow, dawning realization. The mistake he had made was crushing, but his pride refused to let him apologize. With a trembling hand, he unlocked Kevin's cuffs. Kevin rubbed his wrists, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Thank you, officer," he said quietly, though the weight of his words was unmistakable. Derek couldn't respond. He just stepped back, his mind racing, the full impact of what had just transpired beginning to sink in. Kevin nodded to Captain Roberts, offering a quiet, "I'll be in touch, Captain." The room was heavy with unspoken understanding. As Kevin walked out, leaving Derek behind to wrestle with the consequences of his actions, Derek knew that this moment would follow him for a long time. The realization hit him hard. He had profiled and arrested an innocent man, a highly respected FBI agent, based on nothing but his own assumptions. And now the storm was coming. When Derek finally pulled into his driveway, he didn't rush to get out of the car. He sat there, staring blankly at the steering wheel. Time seemed to slow, the hum of the engine the only sound in the world. His mind replayed the day over and over, each loop amplifying the weight of his actions, the consequences of a moment's decision. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. His life as he knew it had changed irrevocably. With a deep, almost defeated sigh, Derek stepped out of the car. The cold air hit him like a slap, but it did nothing to shake the numbness that had settled over him. He walked into the house, the silence of the empty rooms suffocating him. It was a silence that felt different from the usual peace. This one was charged heavy with the gravity of the day's events. For the first time in years, Derek didn't know what to do next. The days that followed were a blur. The weight of uncertainty hung over him like a storm cloud, one he couldn't escape. He'd always been in control. He'd always known what came next. But now, he felt like he was adrift in a sea of confusion, floating in a space between the life he had lived and the one that was unfolding in front of him. The precinct had placed him on leave, the investigation now in motion. All he could do was wait for the inevitable. Friday loomed just days away. 3 days. 3 long days of restless isolation, his mind a prison, replaying the incident over and over again. He had made a mistake. That much was clear. But what gnawed at him wasn't just the mistake itself. It was how quickly it had all unraveled. One moment he was confident, in control, trusting his instincts. The next, his career was crashing down because of a snap judgment. Was it really just a mistake? Derek couldn't help but wonder. Could this be something deeper, something that had been building for years? He had always prided himself on treating everyone fairly, on being the kind of cop who looked beyond appearances. But now, as he examined his actions, the truth began to feel much messier. How many times had he let assumptions cloud his judgment? How many times had his biases shaped his decisions, making someone feel the way Kevin Matthews had? These questions gnawed at him, eating away at the foundation of everything he thought he stood for. When Friday arrived, Derek found himself standing outside the conference room at the precinct, his heart hammering in his chest. He hadn't felt this nervous in years, not since his first days as a rookie cop. The hallway was quiet, a tense silence filling the air. He could hear the murmur of voices from inside, the captain, internal affairs, and unmistakably Kevin Matthews. That was the sting, wasn't it? Kevin was here. Derek had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that he wouldn't have to face him again. He wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to look into the eyes of the man whose life he had disrupted, the man he had wronged so deeply. The door opened, and Captain Roberts stepped out, her expression unreadable. "We're ready for you, Officer Hines," she said, her voice steady. Derek swallowed hard, nodding, trying to fight the lump in his throat as he followed her inside. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. A long table stretched out before him, lined with stern-faced officials. And at the far end, seated calmly, was Kevin. Dressed in a sharp suit, his posture relaxed but his gaze unwavering. Kevin's eyes were fixed on Derek. There was no malice in his stare, but something far more unsettling. A quiet authority that made Derek feel small, exposed. Derek took a seat across from him, his palms slick with sweat. The room was silent. The weight of judgment hung in the air like a heavy fog. "Officer Hines," Captain Roberts began, her voice formal, "this review is to determine the appropriateness of your actions during the arrest of Mr. Kevin Matthews. We will go over the events leading up to the arrest, your conduct during the arrest, and the consequences that have followed. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" "Yes, Captain," Derek answered, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at Kevin again, catching his calm gaze before quickly looking away. "Good," Captain Roberts continued. "Let's start with the incident report. According to your statement, you arrested Mr. Matthews because you believed he was a suspect in a recent series of burglaries. Is that correct?" Derek nodded. "Yes, Captain. I saw him in the park, and he matched the description we had. Tall, black male, early 40s, acting suspiciously, so I approached him." "And what exactly was suspicious about his behavior?" Captain Roberts asked, her tone neutral but probing. Derek hesitated. This was the moment. The one that mattered. He was sitting alone reading a book. But when I asked for his ID, he was evasive. "Evasive how?" Captain Roberts pressed. "He didn't want to show me his ID right away." Derek's voice faltered slightly, and even as the words left his mouth, he could feel how weak they sounded. It seemed like he was hiding something. Kevin's calm voice cut through the tension. I was reading a book, Officer Hines. Not exactly the behavior of a criminal on the run. Derek flinched, but kept his eyes on Captain Roberts. I was just doing my job, Captain. I was trying to protect the community. And did you find anything on Mr. Matthews that would indicate he was involved in any criminal activity? Captain Roberts asked, her gaze narrowing. Derek shook his head. No, Captain. He was clean. The room fell into a heavy silence, as everyone processed the weight of those words. Then, one of the internal affairs officers spoke up, his voice stern. Officer Hines, did it ever occur to you that Mr. Matthews might have been telling the truth? That he wasn't the suspect you were looking for? Derek's throat tightened. He knew exactly where this was going, and he knew there was no good answer. I didn't mean to profile him, he muttered, his voice cracking. I was just doing my job. Kevin leaned forward slightly, his gaze unyielding. Your job is to protect and serve Officer Hines, not to judge people based on their appearance. Derek's stomach twisted. For a moment, he felt a surge of defensiveness, but it quickly gave way to a wave of guilt. Kevin was right. He knew it deep down. This wasn't about protocol. It was about something far more insidious. Captain Roberts cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention back to her. This review isn't just about what happened that day. It's about the mindset that led to your actions. We need to ensure that every officer in this precinct is upholding the values of fairness and justice. This isn't just about you. It's about the integrity of the entire police force. Derek felt a sinking sensation in his gut. This wasn't just about whether he made a mistake. It was about whether he was fit to continue wearing the badge. The weight of that truth hit him like a tidal wave. I understand, Captain, he whispered, barely able to get the words out. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Kevin spoke again, his voice calm but firm, urging for change, for accountability. Derek listened, the weight of every word sinking deeper into his chest. When it was over, he was told he would be placed on temporary leave while the review continued. The next step was still to come, but the damage had already been done. As Derek left the room, the finality of it all hit him with full force. This wasn't just the end of a meeting. It was the end of something much bigger. His career, his identity, all of it was slipping away. The following days passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Derek had never been the kind of man to question himself. But now he had no choice. He had to face the reality of who he had become, and ask himself the hardest question of all. Was he still the man he thought he was? The final review came faster than he expected. This time there was no fanfare, no tension. It was just him, Captain Roberts, and a representative from Internal Affairs. And then the decision. You will be terminated from your position as an officer of this precinct. Derek didn't react. He had expected it, but hearing it out loud still felt like a punch to the gut. He'd prepared himself for it, but that didn't make it easier. You will have the opportunity to appeal the decision, Captain Roberts added, her tone softening just slightly. But given the circumstances, it's unlikely to change. Derek nodded, his voice barely audible. I understand, Captain. The meeting ended. He walked out of the precinct for the last time, not with anger or sadness, but with a deep, overwhelming sense of loss. The place that had once given him purpose now felt empty, a hollow shell of what it used to be. As Derek reached his car, every step seemed heavier than the last. His identity, his purpose, it was all slipping away. He opened the car door and paused for a moment, staring at the sky. The sun was sinking, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The world outside was unchanged, but inside, everything had shifted. He slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The silence in the car was deafening, and for the first time in years, Derek didn't know what came next. Kevin had always prided himself on staying calm, on keeping his emotions under tight control. He had learned long ago that reacting out of anger or frustration would only make things worse. But now, sitting in the quiet of his home, he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The stillness in the air seemed to press down on him, as if the very walls were closing in. His mind kept circling back to Derek. The look on Derek's face during the review, the confusion, the guilt, the dawning realization that he had been wrong. It wasn't the first time Kevin had seen that expression. He'd witnessed it in the eyes of other officers in other situations. But this time it felt different. He could almost hope that it would lead to something more. Something better. But could it? Could this moment change anything? Kevin took a sip of his tea, his gaze unfocused as his mind drifted back to the review meeting. He had spoken his truth, laid it all bare for everyone to see. He hadn't wanted to ruin Derek's life or career. Not really. But he knew deep down that accountability was necessary. People had to be held responsible for their actions, especially when those actions hurt others. If not now, when? The soft clink of his teacup against the table snapped him back to reality. He set it down, the sound echoing in the silence of the kitchen. He stared out the window, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, swallowed by the darkening horizon. This wasn't just about him. No, it was so much bigger than that. It was about every person who had ever been judged, arrested, or mistreated because of the color of their skin. It was about making sure that, next time someone like Derek Hines had to make a decision, they would think twice. Think twice before acting on their biases. Could they? As the light outside dimmed, a sense of resolve began to settle over Kevin. He couldn't change the past, no, but he could help shape the future. He would continue to fight, continue to push for reform, for justice. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Not yet. Just as his thoughts were drifting once more, his phone buzzed on the table. The noise sliced through the stillness. An unknown number. But some small instinct, told him to pick it up. He did, pressing it to his ear, his voice steady yet brimming with curiosity. Hello. A brief pause. And then the voice. Familiar. Professional, yet tinged with something softer. Mr. Matthews, this is Captain Roberts. Kevin's heart rate picked up ever so slightly. He straightened in his chair. Captain, good evening. What can I do for you? I wanted to give you an update on the situation with Officer Hines, she said, her words measured. The review board has officially terminated his employment. Kevin nodded to himself, not entirely surprised, though the finality of it all stung. I see. But Captain Roberts wasn't done. She had more to say. I wanted to speak with you personally, she continued. I know you've been through a lot, and I want to assure you that we are taking this seriously. We're making changes within the department. Training. Accountability. Things are moving in the right direction. Kevin appreciated the sentiment, but he knew, deep in his bones, that words were just the beginning. Real change. That would take time. Effort. Commitment. I hope that's true, Captain, Kevin replied. Because it's not just about one officer. It's about the entire system. A long silence followed, as if Captain Roberts was taking a moment to absorb the weight of his words. Finally, she spoke again, quieter, more reflective. You're right, Mr. Matthews. We have a long way to go. But I want you to know, we're not ignoring this. Your voice has been heard. Kevin's grip tightened around the phone. He could feel the heat of his words, the weight of them. I appreciate that, Captain. But this isn't about me. It's about ensuring that the next person in my position doesn't have to go through this. It's about preventing this from happening again. A heavy sigh, barely audible, came through the line. I understand. And I'm committed to making sure we learn from this. I don't want to see this kind of thing happen again. Kevin stayed silent for a beat. He didn't need to say more. He knew the path forward would be long. But they had to keep moving forward. Thank you for the update, Captain, he said finally, his voice calm yet resolute. I'll be watching the progress closely. With that, the conversation ended. Kevin set the phone back down on the table, his mind buzzing with the news. Derek Hines was no longer a police officer. A step in the right direction. But there was so much more to be done. Meanwhile, across town, Derek sat at his kitchen table, nursing a glass of whiskey. The amber liquid swirled in his glass, but he didn't see it. His mind was 1,000 miles away. His phone lay before him, blinking with notifications he hadn't bothered to check. What was the point? What could anyone say that would make this situation better? He took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through his chest, but it did nothing to thaw the cold feeling lodged deep inside him. The termination had been official for hours now. Captain Roberts had been kind, but there had been no room for negotiation. No second chances. Derek knew it was the right decision, but that didn't make it easier to accept. His thoughts drifted to Kevin Matthews, the man whose life he had so carelessly disrupted. He hadn't even known who Kevin was. But that didn't matter. It never should have. Kevin had been just a man, sitting in a park reading a book. Derek had assumed guilt simply because he was a black man sitting there. And for that, Derek had destroyed his career. Frustration bubbled up inside him. How could he have been so blind? So ignorant? The thoughts swirled relentlessly. Derek had always thought of himself as a good cop. Someone who did the right thing, who protected his community. But now he wasn't so sure. Had he really been doing his job? Or had he been letting his biases dictate his actions all along? He leaned back in his chair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. How could he rebuild after this? His career was over. His reputation in tatters. But worse than that, his faith in himself was shattered. How could he fix that? How could he ever forgive himself? As the hours dragged on, Derek lost track of time. The whiskey did little to soothe him. Then he heard the door open. Lisa had come home. He hadn't told her everything yet. But now, he knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. Derek. Her voice was soft, laced with concern. She saw the whiskey bottle. She saw him. She knew something was wrong. Derek swallowed hard. He couldn't face her, not yet. I lost my job, he said, his voice hoarse. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Lisa's eyes widened in shock. What do you mean you lost your job? What happened? Derek finally met her eyes. The guilt he felt reflected in her expression. I made a mistake, he whispered. A big one. Lisa pulled out a chair, sitting across from him. What kind of mistake? Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of disbelief in it. Derek took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I arrested someone, a man named Kevin Matthews. I thought he was a suspect, but I was wrong. I profiled him. I assumed he was guilty because he was black. And I didn't listen. I didn't give him a chance. I just saw what I wanted to see. Lisa's eyes widened as the weight of his admission hit her. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Derek, are you serious? He nodded, the shame burning deep within him. Yeah, I'm serious. I've been put on leave. After the review, they terminated me. And they were right to do it. Lisa sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. Her eyes searched his face, but she couldn't find the words. Finally she spoke, her voice softening. Derek, I don't know what to say. Derek's voice broke as he whispered. I don't either. Back at his home, Kevin was still processing everything, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wasn't one to let things slide, especially when it came to justice. He typed a quick email to the oversight board, requesting a follow-up on Captain Roberts' promises of reform. Then he leaned back in his chair. His thoughts once again drifted to Derek. The man had looked like a shell of himself during the review meeting. Kevin had seen that look before. It wasn't easy to face the truth of one's mistakes. And Derek, well, he wasn't beyond redemption. Was he? Would Derek be able to learn from this? Kevin didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. There was more work to do. So much more.